With us today, we have Christina Ho. I think most of you know her. She is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary for Accounting Policy and Financial Transparency, U.S. Treasury. Dave Mader, former Controller of the OMB and currently the long title, Dave. I'll say this. He is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Federal Government Practice Civil Sector at Deloitte. Now, that's got to be important, right? And then finally, Adam Neufeld, who is former Deputy Administrator at GSA. So they have a few prepared remarks they're going to make, hopefully share with us their vision for the future of data in the government. And I'm sure that it'll be an engaging session, and we look forward to your questions. So, Christina, can I have you kick it off?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm glad that still so many of you are here because we are like after 4 o'clock. So in the past 3 years, I have been on the journey of trying to implement the Data Act, which was the first open data law in the US. And I'm happy to say here that we successfully published the data by the statutory deadline and also developed the first integrated data standards for federal government, and also roll out a website that the public likes, which I think is a great compliment. Because recently I read some article about how more and more people are starting to use the government website, and most people hate the government website. And I'm happy to report that based on the feedback we've gotten from our users, that they love our website, including my neighbors. So that's really good, because it's not good if your neighbors keep complaining about your work. So I think that's a significant milestone. I have been in the federal government for 8 years, and I know that there have been many management reforms in the past 20 years. I can't think of a major reform that has been implemented on time, under budget, and deliver the benefit that it's intended. So I'm very proud here to tell all of you that we did that, but that's just the beginning, because like the title of this panel, it's not enough to just publish the data. And if we build a pretty website and people come look at it, that's not enough, because it will be a huge missed opportunity to not use the data. And that's why, for those of you who were here this morning to hear Amy Edwards and Justin Marsico's presentation in the demo of some of the analytics we did, that's just giving us a little bit of taste of what the value that it could bring. And I think that that's the reason that we need to continue to expand the Data Act information model schema, the data standard, and publish more data for users to use them and create value. And so I'm excited here, even though the work last 3 years were hard, and Dave here, I'm sure, will agree that it wasn't an easy journey to try to get the entire government to change. And thanks for his partnership and support. We're here, and I know he's very proud of it too, and so am I.
So this is a mutual admiration society. So it's good to actually be here at this point, because I arrived at OMB in June of 2014, right after President Obama in May had signed the Data Act. And one of the first things that I learned as I walked into the building was, oh, you really have your hands full. I don't think we can implement this. In fact, we don't really like to implement this. I think what Christina touched on, it was really important, and that was the collaboration that it was, in the statute, so we had to work together. There's a difference between having to work together because the law tells you to work together and working together because the two organizations and the people involved have the same vision of the future. And whether it was Christina and Christina's entire team, and many of those folks are here, and some of the OMB folks are here as well. I know we want to talk about sort of the future this afternoon, but I think it's important to sort of step back and think about, and Christina touched on it, the remarkable accomplishment not only of OMB and Treasury in being able to design and actually implement, but also the 24 CFO Act agencies, because as many of you know who are in those agencies, some got some funding, but most got none. And yet we were able in May of this past year to actually launch USA Spending, 2.0. And what's interesting is, when you're around this town, it's easy to, have a lot of critics jump out and say, you missed this, you missed that. But what I sort of observed from afar now outside of the government was, we really didn't see that. We really didn't see, headlines in the Post that the government failed to deliver. So I think it's a compliment to everybody that was involved, Treasury, OMB, all of the agencies. Plus, the input that we had received during the course of the 2.5, almost 3-year journey from the IG community, who were part of our steering group, and also GAO and the numerous hearings that Dave Liebrick and I participated in. But what I want to talk about a little bit is the future. Because when you look at the website today, it basically does display pretty much all of the federal spending, at least for non-intelligence agencies, DoD and civilian. And it allows us to look in a very comprehensive way and an easy way, a customer easy way, to look at where is that money going? Who are the contractors? Who are the loan recipients? Who are the financial assistance or grant recipients? So I think where we are now, and Christina touched on it, is it's sort of foundational. We know where the money's going, we know the amount of money that's going out, and we know who has the money. But what we don't know, and this is, I think, the challenge for all of us going forward, is we know what we've spent, but do we really know what the benefit has been for that expenditure? And when you think about Senator Langford's legislation, Taxpayer Right to Know, which when I was at OMB, we worked closely with him and we basically endorsed it. And if you haven't become familiar with his legislation, I'd suggest you look at it, because I think that's the next step in this journey of how to better use government data. Because basically, what his legislation does is says, okay, now that we know all the spending, we want to know it by program, and we want to know which agencies are contributing to which program, and most importantly, we really want to know the results. We want to know what the benefits are for the expenditures. And I think as taxpayers, as the executive branch, as part of the congressional branch, all of those stakeholders and all of us as taxpayers want to know, are our tax dollars being spent and achieving the results that we expect? So I think, to Christina's point, we're at the beginning of I think the next 4 to 5 year journey. And it was interesting to look at the work that Steve Ballmer and USA Facts. And again, if you haven't looked at their website, I'd commend you to look at it, because it basically takes federal data, state and local data. We're so used to, as federal agencies, just looking at federal data. But when that site went up, I spent a couple hours looking at it, and it's remarkable to see sort of the totality, whether you're at the federal level, the state level, the local level, of where resources are being spent in this country and who's benefiting from them. So I'm excited about what we accomplished and looking forward to what we're going to do over the next 5 years. Adam?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So there's been a bunch of exciting and important activities around data and government. I think Data Act is at the top of that list. But the use of data in government in whatever aspect you're talking about, it's still not that wide and it's not that deep, right? And I think that the next few years will determine whether our governments really sort of embrace data, or if it still just becomes kind of pockets of exciting and excellence, but surrounded by mostly the old way of doing business. And this is partly just by my personality, is that like I kind of view things probabilistically, and I think there's an optimistic outcome and a pessimistic outcome, and it's kind of for us to try to increase the chances of the former. And I think that's across the board, whichever way you think about data. So, you know, if you take the use of data for government management, I mean, the optimistic way is, you know, we all of a sudden sort of liberate all this hidden data that's in paper form or Excel spreadsheets. We put in, you know, more sensors and the like. We've got real-time dashboards that allow managers to move things along, and we really spread predictive analytics, right? And we can really manage the government in different organizations really well. But there's a pessimistic view, right? A lot of the data, as you all know, is very poor quality. Sharing data and moving it around is a very political, lower P political effort. Data literacy of many managers, some are very good, but a lot of them, this isn't the skill that they were selected for. And finally, in some cases you have information, but you don't have any levers to pull, right? Knowing that an office isn't working well is only good if you can sort of take the levers to improve it. And so then maybe that's the pessimistic view. And the same thing goes when you talk about using data for government, right? Evidence-based policy and the like. The IT and data standardization allow comparisons in a way that we don't have before. Maybe sharing of admin data will allow for great evaluations. Right now, the estimate is only 1 or 2% of programs have rigorous evaluations or RCTs around them. And then hopefully the budgeting process flows money towards high ROI programs. But again, internal capacity interest in evaluations is pretty low. Stakeholder pressure for existing programs is really hard. And so maybe we end up in a world where just a few academics, a few policy wonks, a few journalists use it. Same thing goes with open data, right? Maybe we end up in a world where we take technical tools like synthetic data and secure multi-party computation, and we can start finally push out PII data in a way that preserves privacy. And lots of companies, journalists, and everything can use it. But the flip side is, it takes a lot of money to put those resources in place to clean the data, push it out. And the public seems to care a lot about scandals, but do they really care about creating new companies? And so my point of this is to not be a downer, but to say the path from data to outcomes that we care about is one that takes a bunch of steps, right? And whenever we introduce things, and I think the Data Act did a really good job of this, is to think about all the next steps in the process and think about all of that and be very thoughtful so that we can get to the optimistic outcome that we all want.
You know, while we're still waiting on the congressman, the one question comes to mind that plays off what Adam just said, and Christina and Dave, I'll address it to you first. And when you think about the implementation of the Data Act, and then you think about where you'd like to see data used or how you'd like to see data used in the government going forward, so the next 4 to 5 years, what's the greatest barrier to making that happen? What's the greatest either institutional or political barrier to making that happen? And how do you overcome it? Not just identifying the problem, but what's the solution?
Maybe Dave should answer that, since I'm still here this week. But I will still.
I challenged her to be bold in her last couple of days, but I don't think so. I think, Mike, and we, Deloitte, did some work with the Data Foundation and issued a report back in the spring on the Data Act 2022, which was sort of a look forward. And we did address in that report what I personally believe are some of the challenges. And the challenges is not about technology, and the challenge is not about the advances in data and how we aggregate and how we analyze data. I think the real challenge is one of leadership on the part of institutions to say, to Adam's point, is because of who we are as the government, we owe it to our constituents, we owe it to our taxpayers to have that kind of total understanding and transparency in which we're going to make decisions. So I think, to me, it's about changing the culture because, when we start, to Adam's point, talking about outcomes, right, and we start looking at programs both in the executive branch as well as, the Congress looking at programmers, authorizers, and appropriators, people could say, we've been spending X amount of money on this particular initiative for 4 or 5 years, but I don't see that we're achieving the results, and we're going to stop that. And all of a sudden, people are going to jump up and go, yeah, but give it another 5 years. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. So I think just because of human nature, it's going to be hard for people in the executive branch. I think it's going to be hard even for members of Congress to make those kinds of judgments. To say, this program is not achieving the results, or there's actually 3 agencies that are doing something similar. Maybe we only need 1 agency, and we only need 1/3 the money.
So I actually think that I echo what Dave said. It's really not the technology or the technical problem. It is a culture problem. I think the federal government is a large institution, and over time it has built a lot of processes with the intent to really mitigate risks, because when you have a complex organization, you have to have some kind of order so that it mitigates those risks. And because of that, it actually reduces the government's ability to really adjust and evolve. And also over time, the federal government, and I think it'll be the same for really other entities too, when you have a lot of bureaucracy, you tend to have more process managers than problem solvers. And I think that that is a huge challenge, because I believe that if we have more problem solvers, we will be able to do more. And also, over time, we have a lot of people in the government. They've been, working very hard and diligent and faithful to serving the public. But I think over time, their identity has been associated with what they have been doing. So there's a natural resistance and insecurity when there's something new that threatens status quo. So there's generally a difficulty in changing, and I don't think that's unique to the government. I see that our distinguished guest just arrived, so I better stop talking and welcome him.
Thank you, Christina. Hi.
Dave Meter, nice to meet you guys.
Just to bring you up to date with where we are. Your timing was great, by the way, because we just finished, and it's a perfect segue to you. For those of you who don't know, Representative Kilmer was a sponsor of the Government Open Data Act, so thank you for that. We really appreciate that. And he's been a champion, and I think I'm just going to turn the mic over to you and tell us what we should be doing and how we get there.
Thanks. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and my apologies for being late. I was going to apologize because I have to leave early, but now I'm apologizing on both sides of the equation because our vote schedule screwed everything up. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the fellow panelists too to discuss the future of government data. To me, this is an exciting conversation really for 3 reasons. One, data can drive innovation in the private sector. I was at a panel on this previously, and someone said, how do you expect, what do you expect to be done if private industry, if entrepreneurs have access to data? And I said, my most exciting answer to that question is beats the hell out of me. Because you already see it being used to create new innovative products, to create new jobs. I can give 2 Texas examples in honor of my co-sponsor, Blake Farenthold, who's not here, but Aunt Bertha is a company that aggregates information on government safety net programs at the federal level, at the state level, at the at the local and county level to match people in need of services with those services. That's an example of using government data and an entrepreneurial company actually creating a successful business out of it. Inography is another company that analyzes patent data and develops analytics and visualization tools for companies to help improve how they manage their intellectual property portfolios. So there's all sorts of things that can be done to create new innovations and create new jobs, which I'm excited about. Second, I think data, and I'm told that you talked about Steve Ballmer's efforts. I think data can drive efficiency within government. You've seen Steve Ballmer, create basically a 10K for government, and he brought together economists and professors and other professionals to put together a database looking at revenue and spending across federal and state and local levels, and really helping you figure out what's working and what's not working, and looking at everything from high-end federal programs to money brought in from parking tickets and how much it costs to collect the fines associated with those parking tickets. I think as you've seen government agencies' budgets get tighter, this holds a lot of potential. On top of that, it has the potential to help drive performance within federal agencies. Imagine if we did a better job of looking at data within the VA system. Perhaps we could have avoided some of the controversies around wait time and some of the scandals that we saw if we'd had more accessible data that had been analyzed on the front end. And then finally, I think data can make government more transparent and more accountable. There's a reason that some of the good government and Sunlight groups are excited about this conversation, because if you make government data open and accessible and usable, you can actually support civic involvement and more accountability. So as I understand it, you've talked a little bit about the bill that we've introduced, Congressman Farenthold and I on the House side, Senators Sass and Schatz on the Senate side, that's really seeking to codify the Obama administration's open government data policy. We included some provisions to ensure that the data is not only available, but also that it's easily used. All of us have had that experience of accessing a government database and finding out it's in a PDF that you can't dive into the numbers, or so actually making it machine readable and open format and malleable, I think needs to be part of the equation. I think I've talked enough about the benefits of it. In terms of kind of where we're at, we're getting closer. You've now seen this policy pass on the Senate side, most recently as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm excited because there's a lot of activity on both sides of the Capitol on this front and outside of government, as evidenced by those of you here in this room. And I think we've got a shot at actually seeing this policy get passed into law. So I appreciate everyone's interest in this. And again, I've probably talked too long already, so I'll stop talking.
So can you stay with us to answer a couple of questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I get the hook in a quarter till.
Quarter till? Okay,
Yeah.
well, you've got 10 minutes. The, one of the things that the Act does is it tasks the OMB director with creating government-wide open data guidance. So first I'll ask you, and then perhaps the other panelists can chime in on their views, but what should that guidance seek to accomplish?
Yeah, some of it's laid out in the bill, and I spoke to this, the idea of having open license, a presumption of openness, I think is important. Machine readability, I think, is important, so that whether it be an entrepreneur who wants to start a new company or a good government group that wants to look at some of these accountability measures, so that there is some capacity to have the data be malleable, I think is an important piece of this. Again, the idea is to protect the information that needs to be protected. I mean, I think that's important. Some of this is actually understanding what data government owns and making sure that there's adequate protections in place in that regard. I think actually that's part of why this policy conversation is important too, because if you don't know what you have, you don't know how to protect what needs to be protected. So I guess that's, those are, I think, are some of the guidelines that I think we'd like to see.
Christine, Dave, Adam, anything you'd like to add to that? Just your thoughts on what that guidance should accomplish?
You know, Congressman, I just sort of spent 2.5 years in the Obama administration at OMB, so I think one of the challenges that Christine and I had working through the Data Act is ensuring that, quite candidly, the executive branch agencies actually follow through with the guidance. And, you know, I mean, we took a pretty aggressive approach because we had a, multi-year deadline, 3-year deadline under the original Data Act to have the new, data elements and all the spending data up there. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges is once you get the guidance, how are you going to actually monitor and ensure that, agencies are actually complying? Because I think, you touched on it. I mean, everybody's budget is either tight or going down, and people will go, oh, unfunded mandate, I'm not going to do that. So, I think it really is incumbent on OMB to sort of communicate to secretaries and deputy secretaries. No, this is important to this administration.
Yeah, I think having led the implementation of the data, I think establishing accountability in the guidance is important, just to Dave's point, because there are, the federal, the executive branch has a lot of different, the structure can be, in terms of the accountability, could be diffused because it's often not based on the outcome, but based on a process that needs to be followed. So I think the accountability of the outcomes to be established, that is important.
And two things, just building off of the accountability, I found that the act of whether, the decision on whether to share data or make it public was unbelievably variable based on where that person sat, and it didn't lend itself to a particularly objective measure. It was actually the reason we created a chief data officer at GSA, was to be the final decision maker about databases going public or even sharing within the agency, because otherwise lots of people were making their own decision. And I think some form of assistance on decision making to take away the risk from that random program manager that they might screw up and share something that is private or whatever could be good, right? So whether that is a technical group that has privacy experts and data experts or whatever it is, that's important. The other is the data quality. Data that is not being used now is generally will frequently be of very low quality, and that was also a really big hurdle. I mean, you're out there as an agency in any day, but especially in a polarized time like today, if you put out data that is not high quality. So anything that OMB can do, or others like NIST or others can do to help automate some of those data qualities, or take that burden off of the random agency, random office, to make that determination and to improve some of the data quality would be really helpful.
Anything else? Questions from the audience? In front. A mic's coming.
Alex Howard, Sunlight Foundation. Thanks for the shout out to Sunlight Good Government Groups. This is one of the first times we've heard much about transparency, accountability, or the idea that the American people should have access to our data. So thank you for all for talking about that and speaking up for it. Thank you for your service in making that possible 5 years on. It's been great to tell people about the success of the Data Act as a collaboration between the different branches of government, and to see what's now happened. Open Government Data Act seems pretty close to passage. Can you talk about why it's important to pass this thing? I know people in the White House Office of Management and Budget who are in charge of supervising the enterprise data inventories that agencies are supposed to be doing. Compliance isn't that great. Why is it important to pass this now, and what should the American people expect to change as a result of this 5 years from today?
You want me to take first crack? So appreciate the question and appreciate the Sunlight Foundation's endorsement of the effort. And to some degree, the work that the Sunlight Foundation does actually makes the point for why this is valuable. we've seen good government groups and transparency groups support this bill because it establishes a policy of making data open by default and usable, and that drives transparency in government at a time where, and I don't say this as a Democrat or Republican, it's just a fact, public faith, public trust in government is low. I think it's very important to have Congress take action on this and see this pass. On top of that, I mentioned, there are other benefits of this. The potential, certainly there's concern, and we've heard those concerns around, just the challenges for agencies in complying. But I would argue that there's tremendous opportunities to drive efficiencies in government if we actually make this available and accessible, because it's also available and accessible by the agencies so that they don't have to recollect information that's already been collected at a time where budgets are tight. I think that just makes a tremendous amount of sense. And then finally, I think the innovation piece of this, I never want to take my eye off of that, in part because you look in my district, so I represent a district that's not in the shadow of the Space Needle, where we have not seen the huge economic boom. But the reality is, one of the ways you can overcome geographic remoteness is with technology. And you've seen companies spring up. I mean, I often point out, I represent a coastal area where people go out and surf. And one of the coolest surf apps comes from government data, from a NOAA database. And so there's all sorts of things that you can do to actually grow jobs, frankly, in areas that sorely need it.
I think one key aspect is the use of it, because it's not, transparency should both be an end and a mean, because similar to the Data Act, we publish the data, but if people don't use it, it's just gonna be another data set out there. And I know over the past several years, both on the government side and even on the public sector, there's more and more data sharing. But we need private sector to engage, to start using these data to create value and solutions for the government, for businesses. So the more we use it, the more it's gonna reinforce the value of doing these and passing these legislation, and the more that there will be incentive for the public office representatives to do that. And I was just in a panel, in a session on the private sector side, that they talked about the startup companies, that how they become really viable businesses based on the data. And one of the big challenges they said they had is the accessing the public data, because they're not easy to find, and they're not always accessible. So I think that the Data Act, the Open Data Act, those are really necessary to continue to help the government to be accountable, but also to stimulate the economy.
I think the key is really in the implementation. And as I mentioned earlier in my comments, what made the Data Act successful to a large part was the fact that both Dave Lubrick and myself, we were focused on this every day, every week. I think Christina, went out 3 or 4 times in that 2.5-year period to each of the agencies and sat down with their key leadership to talk about and to review their implementation plan. And I think, when the legislation passes, then it's going to be the responsibility for OMB to basically communicate that, on part of the administration, the sense of urgency, and, set deadlines that are reasonable. And I think it's going to vary agency by agency. Depends on the type of data they have. It depends on their technology. There's a lot of dependencies, but I think once the legislation is signed by the president and OMB issues their guidance, it would be like, okay, agency Dave, come back and give me your plan on how you're going to implement this over the next 3 years, and have some method of then accounting for that implementation.
Yeah, I don't think there's any shortcut to implementation of this, right? And for it to fulfill the vision, I think how much it fulfills the vision will probably be directly proportional to how strong OMB focuses on it. And I think the Data Act is a great example of that, right? I was occasionally sort of called to sort of knock down obstacles and was constantly getting updated because it was just a ton of energy being put on by OMB and by Treasury. And I think that is the main reason that was a success. And so I think anything that central bodies, whether OMB or others, can do, it will dictate the success of this.
Well, Congressman Kilmer, I know you have to
Sorry.
leave, but I want to thank you for taking the time,
Thank you.
time
Thank
to
you.
share your thoughts with us.
Thank
And
you.
thank you again for your
Thank you very
support.
much.
So other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Dean Ritz with Workiva. You've hinted at, but not used the words performance reporting. And I'm curious when the scale or when the investment will tip from creating standards that are not just about the expenditure of money and where it's going, but structures that can help us understand the results that we're getting from those expenditures. If you could vision into the future.
I mean, I think that early on, this administration put a stake in the ground with the issuance of their executive order with regard to agency reform and asking, and then the OMB follow-on guidance, which I think basically starts the dialogue around, should I be doing this particular mission? Should Adam be doing it? Should Christina be doing it? Should the three of us be doing it? So, I think if you think about the administration's agenda with regard to reform, I think that starts the discussion around, how are we as an executive branch, implementing our responsibilities, and how do we measure ourselves? When you read the executive order and the OMB directive, there's a lot of narrative in there around, talking about the performance of different programs. So I think this is just the beginning, and I think the Data Act, the Congressman's legislation, Senator Langford's legislation, all sort of continue to build on the success we've had.
I think the ultimate solution to the performance is linking data in a standardized way across federal, state, local government, and private business. The reason, in order to really at a scale to understand the performance of the federal government, you have to link those data together because the government spending, we publish, federal government spend nearly $4 trillion a year. And 75% of that money goes outside of the federal entities in the form of either procurement contract award or financial assistance awards. And the performance of those contracts is done outside of the federal government. So it could be in the state government, local government, or university. Without linking data of their output and then ultimately getting to the outcomes back, whatever answer we have on the performance is always gonna be really qualitative. There will be no quantitative assessment at a really credible way and in a comprehensive way about performance if we don't do that. So that's why having continued data standard is so important, and continue expanding the DAMEs that we develop is so important because it's a foundation, and linking to more outside entities so that we can understand the actual outcome of the program.
I agree with all of that. One additional thing that I think could be a driver of thinking about societal your sort of outcomes in addition to just your spending is greater ability, more powerful and flexible levers to to take action based on information, right? So like I was saying before, the data sort of fits in the middle on this process of government change. And I found that we had very different conversations with our programs depending on what type of budgetary account they were being paid for, right? So some of our budgetary accounts allowed for a lot of flexibility for us to reallocate money on our own. Some required some flexibility, but a very broad scope. Others had narrow scope. Others required us to do reprogrammings to go to Congress. Depending on how much flexibility we had, we engaged in different types of analysis because we actually had the ability to do something about it. So I think that if this administration takes certain steps to improve the flexibilities, I think you will see those conversations being had more because you can act on them, right? Without the going through and annoying all your stakeholders, without your whole appropriation process, without all these things, and I think that's really important.
Any other questions from the audience? Because I've got a couple if you don't. So, we had two speakers today from Australia. And they talked about standard business reporting. They talked about the very clear benefits that they've realized from that, both in the public sector and the private sector. So they talked about how much more efficient it's been for regulated entities, and they talked about the benefits to the federal government. So do you see a future where we have standard business reporting in the United States? And if you do, what would that look like, and how would we get there?
Go ahead, Chris.
Short timer gets a short straw,
Okay.
right?
I think it's possible, but the federal government, the U.S. government, is a lot bigger than the Australian government. So to actually implement the standard business reporting mechanism or standard, which is actually really good concept because it's really about, people reporting once, used many times. There are constraints in the federal government in terms of statutory obstacles on sharing data, that type of thing. For example, I work in Treasury, and IRS is part of Treasury, and if I want to get data from IRS, that's not going to be possible either. So I don't, that kind of obstacles will have to be removed in order to totally realize the value of the SBR. But I think it's possible. It will take strong leadership for sure, and also probably the best way to do it is to start small and then incrementally prove out the values and do it that way.
I mean, I think it's possible, and I think to Christina's point, I think it's important to benchmark against other, either private sector or other governments. But when you think about the U.S. compared to Australia or the UK, we're a magnitude, a lot larger, and a lot more complex with state, local, as well as the industry. Sort of reinforcing what I said earlier in my comments, it's not about the technology because the technology is just moving exponentially. So I think it's, to Christina's point, it's like, is there a application, is there an approach that we could actually take and pilot and see, what are the statutory prohibitions, what are the roadblocks, what are the, cultural changes that would have to be made in order to do that.
I wonder if Australia has a WIRA.
Hey, OMB's in the room.
it seems that there are a bunch of obstacles, one of which, to just add, is trust in government, right? As the congressman referenced before, right? I mean, to the extent that I don't know how companies price the inefficiency right here, right? I mean, there's clearly a cost to them of reporting like this, but there's also a bit of a benefit, right? These statutory prohibitions are quite real. They prevent, at least they decrease the likelihood of misuse of information they are providing. And so I think the idea is, in the absence of solving the trust problem, which I feel like is a much bigger, would require more than an hour of conversation by us, you would need some form of stakeholders to, and stakeholder support and technical capacity or something else to make people feel like the risk was worth this.
Karen? Do you have a question? Yes, okay.
I actually have something to add to the conversation that you've just been having. I'm from Australia, those of you who don't know me, who've been part of this
Can hear
SBR journey.
It was
over
really
the
hard
last-
to tell,
can hear.
Karen.
Oh, really?
I thought you were from New Jersey.
I'll try and put on an accent. No, I truly empathize with what you're saying in terms of the complexity of the United States government. 100 plus agencies, so much bigger than Australia. And at the same time, I would like to also address some of the things that you raised around the privacy of information across agencies. We have exactly the same issue. We have the Office of Australian Office Commissioner, Information Commissioner, who actually oversees the transparency of information across agencies, and there are guidelines around what can and can't be shared. And one way that we have overcome that, for example, the example you saw this morning, the demo you saw, I don't think you saw that, Christina, but in that is that we do filter and we do use the rules as to what agencies can and can't see the information. So that is one of the most important things that we've had to address as we are sharing the information. So, I mean, it is a very complex situation, and I think Dave said it very well. Technology comes further down the line. It's about the resolve to work together, and there is a lot to think through, and we're here to help.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Any other questions or comments? Please, well then, join with me in thanking our panel, and especially Dave and Christina for once again being